Hello again. As the Middle Ages went on, people did get used to the normalized form of the Mass, which through the Franciscans in particular went around and became familiar because they needed portable books because of their mobility, and therefore the standardization, the normalization of a certain text became widespread. There did enter into mode a certain natural practice of assisting at Mass. And people certainly had a huge contact with Jesus Christ, but it wasn't always actually praying the Mass itself so much as praying at that celebration using personal devotions. It can be regarded, the period leading up to the Council of Trent, as a period of liturgical decline, but that is too simplistic. However, accusations have been made and some points have been noted. The great emphasis on ex opere operato, that is the work done by God, but through the work done, operated by man, doing certain things. Now, this would be something that out of context could lead to a magical understanding of liturgy without a sufficient emphasis on the corresponding place of man, notably that he has really to pray the prayers and not just mutter them. Now, this is a complex issue because it was something that could be linked also with an insufficient formation of certain clergy. If the priest doesn't understand all the words that he's pronouncing, it can lead to a certain notion of magic, which is actually incomplete with regard to the fullness of liturgy. The way in the West in which the high point of the consecration, and therefore the elevation eventually, was seen as a time of intensity would be surprising to the East, where they regard the whole of the celebration as consecratory and are hesitant to pinpoint God in the same way. The way in which people were ordained, but only ad missam, was something which crept in, that they would be ordaining people to celebrate Masses, but they wouldn't be doing an awful lot of the other sacraments perhaps. So these things were part of what had to be addressed when it came to the Council of Trent. We have an overview of the different stages of liturgical development in this brief summary of Archdale King. He describes the first 3 centuries of liturgical history as those of the primitive liturgy. The 4th to the 8th centuries he sees as that of the formation of the liturgy. The 8th to the 14th centuries, the enrichment of the liturgy. He regards the 14th and the 15th centuries as those of the decline of the liturgy, and the 16th century onward as those of the reform of the liturgy. It is significant that in this expert's view, the development and enrichment of the liturgy continues as far as the 14th century, before experiencing decline. As we shall see, this is the stance taken by the Reform following the Council of Trent. So, there are isolated voices in the period before the Council of Trent which seem to indicate an awareness on the part of some that there needs to be more contact between the people of God and the actual liturgy itself, and not just as a locus in which their own prayer is taking place. But remember that this exploded in the Lutheran revolt, which initially had been something which should have been a purification of the church from within, but we know what happened. It exploded and went out. But we are interested to find how the issues were handled by the church itself, discussed at length. Even the question of Holy Communion under both kinds was discussed by the Council of Trent. Now, we have one very interesting voice of a holy man of this late period. It is the reformer of the Camaldolese. He, Blessed Paul Justiniani, was head of the Camaldolese, but then made the reform, which is still there to this day, the Coronese reform, very strict, wrote, because he was a great erudite monk, the Libellus. By him and also another expert, Peter Quirini. This Libellus, a little book, was addressed to Pope Leo X, Libellus ad Leonem Decimum. So, there were two Camaldolese monks of weight, and they were pleading for widespread reform in the church and, notice, in her devotional practices, including a call for the use of the vernacular readings from sacred scripture in the liturgy, and the correction of questionable pious practices. Now, there were also certain assemblies of bishops here and there. The Diet of Spire in 526. There were provincial synods in Bourges and Sens, Paris, 1528, and then Cologne in 1536, and then Trèves in 1546. As well as various reformed editions of local missals. Now these can be taken as examples of pre-Tridentine reform. There is, in parallel to the question of the Eucharistic liturgy itself, the question of the prayer of the clergy, which is not indifferent either because of its magnitude and wide diffusion and its universal obligation. There were various attempts to address this issue. Pope Leo X, that very same pope to which this libellus had been addressed, and his dates are 1513 to 1521, engaged Bishop Zaccaria Ferreri of Guarda to produce a new breviary. It was to be made much shorter and more convenient, and purged from all errors. So, this bishop went ahead and produced a new edition of the liturgical hymns. These were of high Latin, laboured poetry, redolent of classical reminiscences, and full of clever tricks of versification. So there were things which showed his erudition. And these did receive the approbation of Pope Clement VII. His dates are 1523 to 1534. In 1523. Now, a historian of the Breviary, Pierre Batifol, makes this observation with regard to this attempt. What was deplorable in this experiment of Ferreri's was the whole state of mind which produced it, the ignorance of all liturgical tradition, an utter aversion to the study of it. So, he died, and the prevailing political and ecclesiastical climate brought an end to his work. It was felt to be too much of a discontinuity. Yet, in 1529, at the request of Pope Clement, the Franciscan Francis Quinones, now he would be a cardinal, took up anew the task of a reform of this breviary. Now, it is actually not without importance because of its origin and because of its guiding principles. But actually, eventually, it was not accepted. So, this cardinal understood that his task was so to arrange the canonical hours as to bring them back as far as possible to their ancient form, to remove from the office prolixities and difficult details. Prune, in other words, prune. It was to be faithful to the institutions of the ancient fathers, and the clergy were to have no longer any reason for revolting against the duty of reciting the canonical prayers. That last bit, by the way, enters into the reform that we have in our time. It has been made prayable with joy. The notion of tasting the Psalms has taken the place of the obligation of a large quantity of them. But the grace needs to be unpacked. So, the liturgical expert Pierre Batifol explains, it is no longer a question of praying according to the rules of true Latinity, but in accordance with the institutions of the ancient fathers. That's to say that people, remember, did have Latin in the air, and they were familiar with Church Latin, a living language. So to have something imposed on them which is artificially Ciceronian, going back to an earlier Latin, correct, but straitjacketed, is painful. Not, therefore, to flatter the Ciceronianism of the clergy, but to enjoin on them an office against which they would have no ground for objection. Now, they were trying to get the clergy to enter into true prayer mode in this duty, because remember, divine office means divine duty, officium. It was a universal duty. Therefore, let's get them to pray well, if they're praying at all. So there was a desire to return to the practices of antiquity, ignoring subsequent developments. Now this was in keeping with the Renaissance humanism of the age. But there was also a measure of pastoral expediency, as it would appear that the clergy found the office, as it stood, too much of a burden. Now we know what happens when that's the case. It is said, but it's not said well. So that had to be addressed, and it was addressed well at the Second Vatican Council. We have a very good office if we want to now. Personally, I always sing it, and it's a real celebration. And the quantity now allows that. We can breathe the office because it's aerated with pauses, and the words are not felt to be a duty, but a joy. But Batifor does observe that there is a danger in this, and that it was bordering on what would be the mentality of the later reformers, the Protestants. And he also notes how much was jettisoned. The Cardinal has not hesitated to sweep many things away and to proceed to build a new edifice on a new plan. Responsories are suppressed without mercy, and therewith disappears at one stroke all that beautiful literature of the responsorial, the most original portion of the Roman office. Now, in the Eastern liturgy, there are very beautiful non-scriptural passages, very poetic and very mystical. The Holy Spirit also inspires in the liturgical field. Well, something of that also was in the Western liturgy, but this was being swept away. The Roman distribution of the Psalms disappeared equally. The Psalms are rearranged on a new plan, in an order which is no doubt practical, easy, attractive, but unknown to the ancient church. Anyway, the Breviary was published in 1535 under Paul III as a consultation, from which he welcomed critical comments. Comments were received, taken into account, and the Pope promulgated a new edition the following year. It was intended for private recitation, not public celebration. Interestingly enough, the Cardinal behind this volume intended that the choir office be left untouched. And by the way, something of that comes in the instructions given to us with the new Breviary, the one that we have now. That in choir, the office of readings, the old vigils, matins, still retains its nocturnal character. And also there is a desire that in the orders called to celebrate in choir the office solemnly, that they maintain all three of the day hours, terce, sext, and none. His so-called Breviary of Busy People was not well received, except by the Jesuits. The judgment of the Sorbonne was that the author of the new Breviary has preferred his private judgment to the decrees of the ancient fathers and to the time-honored customs of the Church. Indeed, as a Benedictine Dom Bodo reports, that same Sorbonne convicted as audacious an author who had suppressed ancient and universal customs and broke away altogether from tradition in order to welcome all sorts of liturgical novelties. So, what happened? Some use was made of it, but there was an almighty bust-up in the celebration of Tenebrae at Saragossa one day, on Maundy Thursday. The people do not like the new stuff. To cut a long story short, We're coming now close to the Council of Trent, and a Spanish theologian, John of Arce, submitted a memorandum to the Fathers of the Council of Trent. This was in 1551. He enters into protest on behalf of the rights of the traditional Ordo Psalendi, that's the order of psalmody of the Roman Church, the traditional distribution of the psalms among the various canonical hours, the traditional allotment of the lessons from different parts of Holy Scripture to different seasons of the Christian year, the traditional number of nocturnes. In fact, on behalf of the whole of that liturgical order, based on deep mystical reasons of the most venerable antiquity. He also warns the Fathers of Trent to be on their guard against that innovating spirit which despises antiquity and is taken up with novelties. So, these criticisms are passionate, and the main problem seen is that the reform does not respect objective liturgical tradition. It was an innovation, not an organic development. And as such, however well-intentioned or authorized, was felt to be illegitimate. Now, what is interesting is that this breviary, produced at the request of, and indeed duly promulgated by the Apostolic See, was nevertheless not regarded as beyond criticism. The repudiation of this breviary by rescript of Paul IV in 1558, and its subsequent proscription by St. Pius V in 1568, is the preeminent demonstration in liturgical history of the priority organic development of the liturgy enjoys over approbation by a competent authority. So we have here the principle of reception coming in. On different occasions in church history, things coming down from on high have not been received. Now, this element is to be studied because the element of the life of the church on the level of the sense of the faithful is not without importance. It leads then to a re-establishment of the familiar, which is what was always there, but duly purified. The prudential judgment of Paul III, promulgating this reform in 1536, was therefore corrected. Some 5 popes and 32 years later, in the light of the evident dissatisfaction of the faithful and at the prompting of scholars. Paul IV, now he's reigning at that crucial time when things are happening in England, 1555 to 1559, did not simply repudiate the breviary of this cardinal. He saw the need for some reform. This Pope, Paul IV, understood, it would seem, better than Clement VII or Paul III, the conditions of a good reformation of the breviary, which he, equally with them, felt to be needed. Now, his feeling was this: such a reform ought to be a return, not to an ideal antiquity, but to the ancient tradition represented by the existing liturgy. That there was no need of change in the traditional arrangement of the divine office as it stood in the old breviary of the Roman Curia. All that was necessary was to purge the breviary from errors of history, from literary defects, and from the wearisome prolixities which discouraged the clergy from using it with devotion. Now, this also was in the mind of the Council Fathers close to us, the element of having only truth in the liturgy. Therefore, any readings from the lives of the saints had to be those that were historically true, and there were to be no legendary elements coming in. There is an old saying in French, mentir comme un deuxième nocturne, or menteur comme un deuxième nocturne, lying or as lying as a second nocturne. That was said tongue-in-cheek with regard to some of the legends put there from ancient time, but still stuck there in the breviary, because they had to be, if truly edifying, true, and not just edifying because what they should be saying. So, this also was seen to be an issue. Truth, and also avoidance of too many words. So, pruning and purifying were the order of the day. His efforts were consummated in the breviary reform of the Council of Trent. Paul IV's stance, one of healthy respect for received, developed liturgical tradition, and one that demonstrates a salutary desire to purify it from errors, is an example of becoming behavior by a pope in the supervision and respectful reform of objective liturgical tradition. Now, we have then coming into play this parallel issue of the prayer of the clergy. But there is also an extension of that itself. It's the fact that we have the monastic lung. A great voice in the monastic tradition, not that far away from us in time, is that of the refounder of Solesmes, Dom Prosper Guéranger, a great liturgist, and one who was aware of the importance of restoration. He has a pithy analysis of what is genuine liturgical reform. He breaks it down into 7 points. 1. A liturgical form drawn up to satisfy the requirements of literary pretensions can never last. Now, this actually happened to us under Pius XII. There was a movement to have a translation of the Psalms made according to the principles of correct classical Latin. It was published and slightly used. But the great classicist Christine Mormon went to see Pius XII and had it out with him, indicating that it was not the best understanding of the nature of the living Latin of the Church, that it was not a wise thing to go back to an earlier form of Latin, correct, no doubt, according to the classical rules, but to make abstraction of the fact that the Latin of the Church had had a life of its own, with which the generation in question was familiar. And as a result, he commissioned the Neo-Vulgate, and it was the work of the Benedictines at San Girolamo in Rome which gave us the Vulgate purified, and which we have now in the Breviary in Latin. In the monastic offices, that is the choirs where they have the old books, they're still allowed to use them, those that use the Vulgate as such for the Psalms, but the new editions have to be those of the Neo-Vulgate. Now, what happened to the Neo-Vulgate? Taking into account this valid observation, it was then commissioned that the Vulgate as such should be taken up, the Psalms of the Vulgate, and purified from what had to be purified to make them faithful to the Hebrew, in the case of the Psalms, but only changing what had to be done for that, maintaining the idiom of the centuries, so that it is recognizably the same. And that is actually what we have. The first time that one takes up the Neo-Vulgate as a monk, one is a bit surprised to see this new bit coming in now and again. But essentially, one feels the continuity, it is the same. And one sees each time they have adjusted it, that it had to be done, because what was often happening was this. St. Jerome had before him the Hebrew without the points, Masoretic points, which came in centuries later, therefore without the vowels, if you like. And he was basing it a lot on the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation. And essentially, he respected so much that the words that he had before him, that he would never dare to make a paraphrase. So even at the cost of clarity, he would reproduce in Latin exactly what he saw before him, with the help sometimes of the Septuagint. The result was that quite often, in practice, there were points that were too obscure to be sung with intelligence. And therefore these were the bits that had to be addressed. And also any which came from precisely the lack of tools that St. Jerome would have had in translating without sufficient, perhaps, other translations and versions at hand to indicate the real original meaning. And so we have now, with the experts on side and a great plethora of manuscripts, the best that we can have with regard to the Vulgate made pure, of things which actually, when said as such in Latin, do not make good sense. And we must remember also that St. Jerome would not have had the tools that we have to see the problems of certain words, and how in Hebrew, if one has these dots, the points, it makes greater clarity for seeing whether something is active or passive or whatever it might be, because things change completely according to these points. And therefore, he could have misread certain things which can be taken that way without points. Because remember, Hebrew written primitively only has consonants. And the consonants change in their sense according to where one puts what we now call vowels. They're the points. These were put on by the Masoretes in the 9th and 10th centuries. So, all that to say, it's a complex issue, but it was felt very strongly as a problem when it came to the language of the praying church. Now, monks are bound to feel this because that's their life. St. Jerome, of course, was living as a hermit there in the grotto of Bethlehem, near the manger. So, that's one point. Another one of Prosper Guéranger: the reform of the liturgy, if it is to last, must be brought about not by the learned, but must be done with due reverence and by those invested by competent authority. Third, in the reform of the liturgy, one needs to guard against the spirit of novelty, restoring ancient forms that have become defective in their original purity and not abolishing them. So restoring and not abolishing is his principle. And that was also the principle at work there in the Neo-Vulgate. Fourth, abbreviation is not liturgical reform. The length of the liturgy, he says, is not a defect in the eyes of those who should devote their lives to prayer. Fifth, to read large quantities of sacred scripture in the office does not satisfy the whole obligation of priestly prayer, because to read is not to pray. Now that's kind of important. To read is not to pray. It's the locus of prayer. Prayer can be happening, but one does not have to be equated with the other. Sixth, there is no foundation to distinction between public office and private office, because there are not two official prayers of the church. Now that would explain why, until recently, there was an obligation for the clergy, who were fulfilling the obligation precisely of the prayer of the church in the Breviary, to pronounce the words. The lips had to move. In the old rite there of the Mass, the priest's lips are moving in the canon, the consecration, but the voice is not heard. A similar obligation was there with the Breviary. And so you would hear priests muttering away before. Remember that when I was growing up there, my spiritual father, he would always whisper the office, even in church. So that was addressed in the 80s, and it was a rescript given by the Congregation for the Discipline of the Sacraments, Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacraments. At least it was, I believe, the secretary of that congregation or its head, whatever, who gave this answer that it was sufficient to read the words of the Breviary. So that clarified things, that one was regarded, and that's the position now of the church, as praying the office if one does pray with the mind coupled with the movement of the eyes. However, the instinct is there in quite a few priests still to use the lips because of the public nature of the office. Personally, I would always do that, and as I say, always sing it normally here in the Hermitage. It is not just a private devotion, it is the prayer of the church, and therefore has a certain external part of it to be executed. The position of the body too enters into it. It's not just enough to sit comfortably in an armchair with one's feet up. It's more than that. It's the prayer of the church, and it's liturgical. Therefore, the logical consequence is that it's celebrated and not just got through mentally. That's my instinct, but take it for what it's worth. However, the obligation is satisfied, according to this rescript from the Vatican, by reading. That can help one, if, for instance, if one is on the train. But just be aware that there is more to the Breviary than meets the eye. It's not just a personal devotion. And remember how St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, a great Carmelite mystic, did say that one prayer of the Breviary has far more value than many prayers which are not of the same order. The reason being, of course, that it's the prayer of the church, the prayer of Christ himself. So, last of all, number 7, it is not an evil The rules of divine worship are numerous and complicated, because the cleric needs to learn with what diligence he should accomplish the Opus Dei. Now, with regard to that, we have the advantage in our time of having a much simplified office. It does help, actually, and many things are given in alternative forms. One can do it with this text or that text. Just to illustrate what I mean, when it comes to a memorial, one can do most of it from the ferial, that is the ordinary, or one can do nearly all of it from that of the saint. It depends on one's personal devotion. There are only certain things that one has to do from the saint on memorials. On feasts it's quite different, and on solemnities it's more different again. But there is this latitude there, and it's all clearly laid down in the general instruction at the beginning. But it does help us, because it takes away this anxiety and tension, because the Church wants us to pray and to celebrate that prayer, and indeed enjoy it. It's the prayer of the Church. And as in a prayer meeting, one goes into prayer mode, engaging with the Lord, spontaneously in that case, but one doesn't think about the way it has to be automatically, perfectly addressed and all the rest of it. It's an element of spontaneity and friendship comes into it. So too, something of that has come into the new mentality, which is healthy, both in the liturgy of the Eucharist itself and in that of the Breviary, of actually somewhat engaging without tension, therefore relaxing in the Lord, that there's a simplicity there in the rubrics compared to what was there before, both in the Breviary and in the liturgy of the Eucharist itself, which does enable us to relax in the Lord and celebrate the Lord and meet the Lord and think about the Lord. Because the problem is this: it used to be called rubricism or ritualism, that one is actually so much concerned about correctness in the rite that one thinks about the rite rather than about the friend, the Lord, the one engaged with. So that's helping us. It's a new way and a healthy way of doing the thing with the same validity, because the validity is assured if we obey in the words and the gestures, but with that other bit of relaxing as we would with our best friend. And there is a huge advantage too with regard to the way in which, for instance, if we use the mode of chant which is known from memory, without having to look for pages or announce a number for the people. The great advantage of the plethora of These chants and the like is that we can bring the people into chant mode with eyes closed. It's a great blessing, because then one can focus on Jesus and not on looking for a page. So we have a great adventure before us, both in the Breviary and in the liturgy of the Eucharist itself, if we wish not to make a minimalistic thing, but actually to enjoy what is on offer. The Spirit wants to purify and make electrified what has always been there, and we are the generation apply it with maturity, tranquilly, but also with continuity, with respect for what has come to us, and not with any presumption that we're the first to get it right. I would just like to conclude with something I wrote when still a deacon, but being taught bit by bit how to celebrate Holy Mass, both in the new rite and in the old. Our community was very liturgical in orientation, and we were encouraged to know all we could about liturgy. In the daily celebration of the High Mass there on the altar, the high altar, we had maintained Latin. The whole celebration was fully sung in Gregorian, but it was the new celebration, the new Mass of Paul VI, but facing the other way on a weekday, facing the miraculous cross that we had there, the old medieval cross, and facing the rising sun, as the church was orientated. And that's how it was meant to be, because the church was built for that. But we were also taught, if we wanted, the old rite, and we could celebrate that in private. And so, as I was coming close to ordination, I was learning well the new and the old, and seeing how one came from the other. And it hit me how these gestures were ancient, how one had the centuries before one was handling living history. And the mystical nature of the old rite is such that in the silence one hears more. There is a detonation of power in a whisper. And so I wrote these words aware of the power in a whisper and in a gesture which held the whole of human history since the upper room. Closer. Tridentine initiation, that is, when being taught how to celebrate in the old rite while yet a deacon. Not once, not twice were gestures such as these about a Godhead made. Nor fades the day, the distant dawn on dawn, that history sees in these rites rise again, where hid wings play with essences untold, that we make bold to call into a corner of the globe by movements well rehearsed, by sounds that hold in all their whispered strength the high king's robe. O covering of a kingdom yet to come, and yet come now, at last, where waiting was long, very long, in longing that for some seemed long past hope. This groping this morn has the heavy signs of blessing old restirred, and I the muttered centuries overheard.